Okay, welcome. We're going to start. Probably a few more people may arrive. I'm Frederick Foldemery with Computing, and I'm here just to do a short introduction. This is the first Whitehead lecture for this year. This will have many more during the year. It's a series that's jointly run by the Department of, or the School of Psychology and Computing, and the School of Computing at Goldsmiths for many, many years. I forget when it started, maybe Karina, you remember? 2003, so we've passed 20 years. Karina, who sits here from psychology, is responsible for the psychology side of running the show. And since this year or last year, William Latham is responsible for the computing side, and the two group select interesting topics and speakers. Typically, we get speakers from outside Goldsmiths. And today we have the pleasure of having Dylan Banarse and William Latham. So I'll say a few words about both of them and then let them entertain us. There should be time for questions, at the end. And notice today we brought a number of documents, and you are welcome to pick one on your way out. And these will explain many of the details that will be covered today. And there is an exhibition you may already know that is running jointly with today's lecture at the Oxo Gallery, which is on the South Bank in London, between London Bridge and Waterloo. A very nice walk from either side. And it's running until Sunday from 11 in the morning until 6 p.m., free entrance. So just a few words now about the speakers. Dylan Banarse, senior research engineer at Google DeepMind. He's been there since the early days of DeepMind, when Dylan tells me there were about 16 people, and now there are hundreds. We don't know the exact number. That's in London base. DeepMind is part of Google now, so there's also larger activity across the world, and in particular, another big lab on the West Coast in the US. Dylan works on different topics, including AI, artificial life, and computational creativity, which are definitely relevant to today's lecture. He's also worked on evolution. He has a PhD on biologically inspired neural networks. He's done many other works over the years, including for the BBC. I'll let him say more later if he wants. William, just a few words. I think most of you know of William and his work, but wanted to situate the work historically speaking. So William explored the topic of grammars for artistic outcome, and in particular grammars for 3D forms since the 1980s. This led him in the late 80s, early 90s to work at IBM Research Labs with Stephen Todd. So unfortunately, Stephen would be a perfect third person to have with us today. We did the work with Dylan, and William cannot be with us. Sends his apologies. William and Stephen then worked since the early 90s on their concepts. There was a short break. Well, there was a break of about 10 years from mid-90s to mid-2000s when William joined Goldsmiths. William has started work in art at Oxford, went to the RCA. Some of his exhibitions have toured the UK. He's been also in exhibitions around the world. Some of the most recent was in China last year in Beijing. So the topic of today is foundational evolution. The speakers will tell us more about it. And remember that there's a joint exhibition again. You're welcome to go later on until Sunday. Thank you, and please welcome the speakers.
Many thanks for coming, and good to see lots of familiar faces in the audience. So Dylan and I thought we would use this as an opportunity to talk about our collaboration during the past 9 months, which we've pretty much kept under wraps until the show opened at the Oxo Gallery last week. And so really this talk is going to be quite organic. We're going to pass it back and forth. It's really just to give some insights into the work that we've done and share some of the things we've learned and share some of the new directions that we're going on to develop. And in particular, we'll explain the title of the talk and exhibition around evolution and foundation as part of the talk today. So this is, in essence, a software engineering collaboration. So Stephen Todd, who I've been working with since 1987, with a break for about 13 years when I was in rave music and games industry, but it could be a continuous collaboration apart from that period. And Dylan has now been working extremely closely with us, connecting our mutator and form grow technology, which has been developed over a period of time, with Google DeepMind's AI systems, and in particular, using one of the newest versions of Gemini. And so what we've found is by plugging together this technology, lots of cool and exciting stuff has emerged very, very quickly. This is screenshots of the exhibition. And within the show, what we show is big evolutionary drawings of strange organic forms that look natural, but they're definitely not natural. And as part of the talk, we'll talk about how we've generated that art. So these are some of the drawings in the show. On the left-hand side, we can see that we've plugged in the word horseshoe crab as the prompt, and over 200 generations, starting with a stack of cylinders, plus the form grow grammar, nothing else, we can start to get to things that look like horseshoe crabs, or sort of getting on the way to looking like horseshoe crabs. On the right-hand side, exactly the same starting point, a stack of spheres, about 8 spheres stacked on top of each other, and we can get, using the prompt diatom, some reasonably good looking diatoms. A big surprise. Evolution's had millions of years. Just with nice grammar, with a good prompt, we can get to surprisingly natural structures. Frederick is curator of the show, and I've been working with Frederick nearly as long as Stephen, a long time. However, with Dylan, we have the team from Google DeepMind at King's Cross, in particular Chrysanthep, who's here today, but we're working with a group that's focused on human creativity, an absolutely fantastic topic. And as part of this talk, we're going to explain a little bit about how the collaboration started. There's just a little bit more background on the art. I trained as an artist. I can draw. I went through the Royal College of Art. And today, this is the structure of what we're going to cover. Probably some sections in more depth, other sections in less depth. The background, the core work, and in particular, Dylan is going to be talking about some of the technical details in that section. And then we talk about the exhibition specifically at the end, and then future vision and ideas. So quite a lot of content to cover. And in essence, what we're doing is we're taking evolution and driving it with an AI foundational model. So we're using procedural technology on the evolution side, and then we're plugging it into an AI system that helps us to do all the scoring. And these are some of the outcomes. 200 with the prompt rows, 200 generations in, we get a strange sort of very peculiar rows. And these are presented as artworks in their own right. So this is one of the reasons for creating this giant evolutionary tree, is to kick out artworks, which are like instances from a giant evolutionary tree. One of the key things which people don't always realize is these forms are three-dimensional. We can rotate this and look at this from any viewpoint. For the purposes of the evolution, we, as Dylan will also explain, we're just using a single viewpoint. So from the side, this may not look like a rose. However, it's what is surprising, like where we've used the prompt fly's head in 3D, we get a pretty good fly head just from a single viewpoint. Us working away, Stephen and me, and Peter Todd. So I went, so this is kind of the history. And drawing is extremely important within the group. We are endlessly doing drawings explaining how the form grow grammar will work, where these forms will grow little buds, or where things will grow out of them like maggots in idiosyncratic ways. So drawing is still extremely important, particularly when you're dealing with complex structures. How you communicate the grammar, three-dimensional structures, the rules, if you like, drawing is still very, very important. The background goes back to 83, 86 with the form sense drawings, which I did when I was a student at the Royal College of Art. And with no computer, but using my own brain as the visualization tool, we had a set of platonic solids, a number of rules which could be applied to those, and you go round and round this loop. And I was able to use my brain to imagine the consequence of the rule being acting on the form and then drawing the outcome. And the result were these big evolutionary drawings, which were like the blueprint for everything that was to come next. And in particular, originally, my idea was actually to use this as a way of designing sculptures, given this kind of huge variety of forms that would emerge. But even at this point, I was being heavily influenced by evolution, spending a lot of time in the Natural History Museum. And these types of illustrations, we've used right the way through, including in the early work. Heavily influenced by Charles Darwin, the idea of evolution. All the work that we've done is all about harnessing evolution for creative ends. And bizarrely, one of my beak operations was influenced by Charles Darwin's observation that finches had different beaks on different islands. So in my rules, I include the word beak as a kind of humorous reference to Charles Darwin. And my forms grow beaks out the side. And Dylan said, very early on in the collaboration, let's use some of these drawings, let's get these evolutionary trees mapped out so we can see the history, and like the original drawings have got little lines pointing at the offspring. It's worth observing we're only presenting a fraction of the potential forms. Every single little triangle, or it represents an evolutionary dead end. I went 1987, 1988 with Stephen in the lab. But it's worth highlighting at this point, and this grammar is what we're using right now. The form grow grammar was heavily influenced by DNA, and particularly secondary structures. So this is one of our mutator forms from that time that's gone through an evolutionary process where the human is picking and breeding, but the fundamental logic is linked to a kind of very rudimentary molecular system. And the work then and later was focused on you pick and breed, and the human is making the selection. And the challenge for the human is after 50 generations, the human is starting to get pretty tired. I, as the artist, have pick and breed, pick and breed, pick and breed. There's a point where you say, no way. Whereas what's fantastic with the collaboration with Dylan is we can run the system thousands and thousands of generations. It's opened up Pandora's box. The wealth of form goes way beyond what the human is capable. And there's a kind of evolutionary fruit machine where all the values are being mutated. But as we'll see more recently, we've now got structure mutation working very, very effectively. Okay, we move forward. And this fundamental idea is it's kind of evolution by aesthetics. And we present the works in the gallery, and people are normally pretty confused by the work. It looks natural, but not natural at the same time. Carl Sims was doing work at the same time. Okay, so I will pass over to Dylan shortly, but I'll start off by highlighting how the collaboration started. And Dylan, do you want to cover this as well?
Yep.
Okay.
So I mean, it started. I think it started through Piotr introducing me to. So Piotr has been working at Goldsmiths, and he also works at Google DeepMind, and he'd been speaking to William, and obviously been discussing this process and evolution, and said it would be interesting to do like a collaboration where we could use some of the AI from Google DeepMind and sort of tie it into this evolutionary system. And we didn't know what it would be good for at the time, so we're going to explore what the uses of it would be, and see where we could go from there. So we started about a year ago. We had our very first meeting. We sat down and came up with some ideas, and then we had some initial sort of investigations, which I'll talk about, until we sort of like finally honed on what we went to for the exhibition.
Yep.
So which button? So I mean, I think this is something that William's sort of like been thinking about for a long time. Well, you know, in the decades of his work, was whether a computer could actually do something like the ink block test. So you know, this is something that I guess is what you do when you're selecting your forms. You're looking at them and looking at the potential sort of what they could represent, where they might go if you were to click and involve them in a certain direction. And the human brain is exceptionally good at looking at images and sort of like seeing things in those images that computers traditionally aren't very good at. So one of the ideas was, would Gemini and other sort of like state-of-the-art AI systems be able to do something close to the ink block test and be able to select candidates through this process and direct like the evolutionary process. So yeah, at the heart of this thing, we have the form go grammar, which is the grammar that generates the sort of like near infinite sort of different types of three-dimensional structures that you can get. It's way vast. You know, the space of things you can generate is phenomenal, and the limitation has been essentially the human being in control of this process and being able to like select which ones they're interested in and direct that process. There's only a sort of like a certain space you can investigate, explore within a certain amount of time before you get tired, and you have your own biases as well. So you might always go down particular routes, not knowingly, and there may be like different avenues that you haven't explored. So up until this point, it had been human as the selector, and the mutator software has always been doing the mutations under the hood. And so I think like you know, when you're making your selection as a human, you're very much influenced by all the sorts of imagery and things that you've seen in your life, and these are things that sort of you look for patterns. You spot something in a fairly abstract three-dimensional image, and you'll say, "Oh gosh, that looks a bit like a mite or some sort of nematode or something like that," and then that will like then sort of influence your decisions going on down there. Although you may change at some point when you get to another form that looks suddenly like something else, and you can switch direction. And these are
pre us working together.
Right. So yes, these are some sort of early sort of examples of the some of the form grow things. And yeah, do you want to say a bit about?
So the other topic that we included in our very first meeting was the painter Archibaldo. The question was, with our form grow grammar, if you got Gemini to do the scoring, and we say head, would we end up with stuff that looked like Giuseppe Archibaldo's paintings? And that was the premise. It was great, like a case study of how you could combine all sorts of 3D structures to make some new content. So the ink block test, can a machine perform the ink block test? And Archibaldo were the kind of two kind of key directions that we explored. It was very useful with research to have some kind of anchors that you can refer to. And as we get later on, and Dylan talks about our attempts to evolve chickens, which was Chrysantha gave us as a great test study, Archibaldo came back into the frame, and we talked about him a lot again. Absolutely amazing paintings from 16th century. So I can talk. I'll talk briefly about mutator and form grow, and then pass back to Dylan. So one of the interesting things that once we connected up mutator and form grow to Gemini is we got absolutely nothing. We just, the machine was just not seeing the content. We'd present all this stuff to it. So what that forced us to do was to get into the form grow grammar and mutator and revamp things. So one of the key things that we got working was structure mutation. Up to this point, we've been doing mainly parametric mutation. So each of these values, if we change the rib cage from 100 to 500, the whole thing would close up. And so by adding structure mutation, as you can see here, all the new elements are a result of structure mutation. Literally, things would grow at different points on the structure. We had to revamp our grammar to be able to deliver what was potentially needed. And in particular, what we did was we tested new functions such as twist X, bend X, manually, interestingly. We tried again and again, add branch, fine-tuning the parameters. And it was only when we'd done that we knew that the system was capable of generating the variety of forms that were necessary. So this is the form grow grammar. You can see our kind of long chain-like structures with different elements like rib cage, branch, twist, bend, stack. And that would become a starting point for mutation. Again, drawings were very, very important to kind of explain the structure. And in many ways, kind of structural biology has had a big, big influence on the whole project. And also here in the design of the structures, they're based on my observation of the natural world, plants, insects, tapeworms, bed mites, the lot. So it's a kind of concoction of different grammar. One thing that we did add was something called pixel score, which was an interesting development. And that what pixel score does is it's outside Gemini, but what it does is it encourages growth. So it looks at the image, and Stephen gave me some text to read, but I'm not going to do it. And what it does is it rewards any new structures or new horn forms that are appearing. And what it does, okay, so whichever is the most complex, it breeds and generates a new version of. So, and this is a phase that we're even using with the AI. We'll drop it into pixel score. If things get a little bit dull, things aren't really moving, we either bump up the mutation rate or we chuck it into pixel score to reward growth, if you like, for a while, and then pass it back into the Gemini system. So these are just examples of some of the outputs we're getting from pixel score. Different graphics. So back to Dylan.
Okay, so just a quick sort of background on Gemini, which is sort of the foundation model from Google DeepMind, and I thought it would be apt. So I got Gemini to generate this particular slide all itself. So I basically got to ask it to explain what foundation models were and to generate an image for it. So essentially, a foundation model it's like ChatGPT. It's a very large AI model. It's been trained on a wide range, diverse types of data. So not only text, but also images, audio, video, and things like that. And so what that means is that essentially you've got a lot of structure in language, you've got a lot of structure in images, and you've got a lot of structure in audio. And when you train networks on this stuff, they sort of embed this structure within their architecture. And if you're training them on multiple different types of data at the same time, then there's close mapping between the sort of the textual information and the image information and the audio information. So it can make connections across those domains. So if you say if you type the word chicken, then it's got like a whole load of visual references that it can tap into that are associated with chicken, from sort of cartoons to drawings to photos, and similarly textual wise, it's chicken can refer to chickens in fiction and fact and medical, all sorts of sort of areas. So these sort of cross connections and the cross modality connections allow these sort of networks to make these sorts of interesting sort of like connections across these different areas. And so this is why this is one of the reasons why sort of Gemini and foundation models like this are particularly good at you give it an instruction of does this look like something or other, and it's quite good at just thinking outside the box. Old sort of like sort of more older sort of AI technology would have been one that's just been trained on a set of images and maybe we're doing something closer to pattern matching or something like that. So whereas this is more sort of conceptual mapping to image mapping. So that's why we sort of felt that Gemini would be a good system to hook into this process to see if it could then guide this evolutionary process. So going back to the beginning, so essentially we identified like two sort of broad areas where we thought Gemini might be useful in this sort of the new process of bringing together Gemini to Mutator and FormGrow. So one was, could Gemini be used as a mutator itself? So could it understand the FormGrow grammar? And if it could understand that, could it make sensible mutations to that grammar? Could it generate new variants of FormGrow's structures that would normally be done by the mutator? And could those be different to the types of ones that the mutator does, and could that be like an interesting avenue to follow? And then the other sort of use of Gemini was not mutating the things, but could it assess the images that were coming out, and could it give us like a score as to how good it was, or whether it's matched a certain criteria, or whether it was going in the right direction, or whether it was thought it was interesting, and were the decisions and the thoughts it was going to make on these, were they the similar ones that we would make, and were they ones that would it come out with stuff that we thought was useful, or would it just come out with stuff that it thought was useful but we thought was not? So these were the sort of two broad areas that we wanted to investigate. So the first one was essentially we looked at Gemini as a mutator. So essentially we have the FormGrow rules going into Gemini. So Gemini takes, just like these other sort of chat AI things, big long text of string, you got big long string of text or images. So we just give it the whole text for the rules, and we gave it a prompt which says, here are the rules. We gave it a copy of the manual that basically described what the language was, how you parameterize the different things, and how you could write these sort of rules yourself. And we asked Gemini just to generate some mutations, some new versions of these rules. And then we used Mutator software to then render those and have a look at the outcome. So the way we prompted it was essentially we had a bit of prompt which sort of explained that the rules that it was looking at were rules that were describing three-dimensional structures that were going to be sort of grown in a generative piece of software. We then sort of inserted the whole instructions of how that language worked, so it could get an idea as to the syntax and that sort of things. Then optionally, we gave it some examples of different form grow grammars that we already had of different types of forms, and then we said, here is the one that we want you to mutate. We gave it a particular string which defined a particular form, and then said, now can you please give me 3 different versions, mutated versions of this thing, and make them all different and output them in a file format, which we could then put back in through Mutator and have a look at the output. And so these were sort of, I don't have the original parent that it was mutating from, unfortunately, but I think it was a fairly simple sort of like structure. And what Gemini did was it came out, it explained what it was doing. It sort of said, oh, I'm going to try to add some extra ribs to this. I'm going to add some twist. I think this is going to do this to this. And it explained various different things it was going to do. It gave them names as well. So it said this one's going to be the twirler, this one's called the crown, and this one's called the web. And it actually was trying 3 different types of mutation. So it said, right, okay, because I'd said 3 different, I didn't say 3 different types of mutation, but I asked for diverse types of mutations. So it decided like a parameter one, a structural mutation, and a transformation one. I mean, the problem was partly that what it thought it was doing didn't necessarily translate into what it actually ended up doing. It would change the rules a bit. Something would come out. It wouldn't necessarily describe what it thought it would come out, and it would quite often make syntactical errors as well. So it didn't really have a good understanding of the language and the structure. It would stick certain bits in, like a stack in the wrong place where it wouldn't, it syntactically would not make sense. So it was making mistakes, but it was quite interesting that it could do some mutation straight out of the box like that. And we weren't showing it the output. We were literally just giving it the text and saying mutate this. So there are advances you can do to this. And then when we gave a variant on this, we gave it different examples of what a mutation would look like. So we said, okay, here's a parent string, and then here are 3 different mutations of it. And these were mutations that we got from the mutator. And so we thought that would give it a bit more of a sort of like idea as to what you can do and what the sort of like parameters are, the sort of scope of mutation. And so these are the sorts of examples that Mutator would come out with if you gave it that example on the far left. Quite radically different mutated versions of the structure. The best Gemini could do were mutations, but they're all very similar. They were quite small mutations. So again, this was like a fairly simple sort of like experiments. It was very promising that it could do something out of the box. It hadn't ever seen this language before. This was the this I don't think it would have seen. It wouldn't have been in the training data. So just from the examples it saw and the manual, it was able to infer. So I think you could follow this route some more and get some very interesting results. So yeah, so to roughly sort of conclude the Gemini as a mutator, it looked like it has potential, but it was making errors. It didn't have the diversity when we did give it examples, which reduced the errors, and there is no feedback. So I think you could improve this if you gave it the feedback and said, here is the mutation, here was the output, now how do you change the mutation? And you could actually generate a data set on that, and then you could actually fine tune a model on that, so it has a much better understanding of the mapping between the rules and what gets generated and what the mutations do and that sort of stuff. So that's where we sort of parked that for the moment, and then we went to look at Gemini as the assessor. So for this, essentially, you can just upload, you can just go to Gemini website now, and you can upload any image, and you can say, what is this? It can be a fairly abstract image like that, and it will come out with like quite an interesting sort of like breakdown of what it thinks it's looking at, it will pull out sort of like references to sort of biological structures and fractals and things like that, textures and that sort of stuff. So it's able to look at images and give you a sort of aesthetic quality sort of breakdown of what it is and structure and content and that sort of stuff. So straight out of the box, the first thing we did basically, we gave it some very early mutator examples and just said, what are these? And and it was, so this was quite encouraging. Essentially, this looked like a fossilized crinoid marine animal, and it looked very plausible, looked really good, and it said that thing. And I think when I prompted, I said, what is this, and would it be good for evolving something from? Because in the prompt there it says, or maybe I didn't get it in that prompt. It sort of says, oh, this one is a bit too, there's not enough detail in this. I don't think it evolved much as well as, actually maybe it's in the next, this one. So I gave it both images, and then I said which one would be the best one as a starting point if you were to like take it and evolve it on to try and create more interesting or complex structures. And so it sort of says, skeletal, rib-like organic structure. The second one is simple and abstract. I'll go with the first one. I think it's got more potential for evolving. So this was essentially the sort of like the seed piece of information back from our early experiments that essentially we could put Gemini into sort of the driving seat of this sort of evolutionary process. And so then we did some early experiments with the chicken gull from Chrysanthus. So essentially, humans are very good at recognizing a chicken. So essentially, if we've got something that can generate anything, if it can't generate something that we recognize as a chicken, then maybe there's something wrong with it. So let's see if we can generate something that looks sort of chicken-like. Not the form grow grammar isn't designed to necessarily produce chicken-like stuff. So this isn't an easy task for it, but we got some quite nice sort of like results from that. Some more sort of examples of sort of chicken sort of examples that we got there. And then these are some more of the sort of chicken ones that we got later on in the experiments, which are in the gallery at the moment. Some of them are. And then as some sort of extra experiments then, so that was giving it a target like a chicken. We tried some open-ended ones. Essentially, we didn't give it a target as to what to select. We gave it a set of aesthetic drivers, a variable list of ones. Sometimes it was a large one, sometimes a small one, but essentially it was a list of aesthetic drivers that William gave us, which was various different sort of cultural references, design references, and things like that. You have in the back of your mind when you're sort of selecting. And we sort of said, here are some. We tried this with and without as well, and basically just said, pick your own goal, decide what it is you want to go for, and just pick something that you think is remarkably good given all of the aesthetics that you're looking at, and then pick a goal and use that goal, but update your goal depending on what you're looking at, and let that influence your goal. And a lot of our experiments sort of like went through this sort of spiral process, and quite often ended up in a sort of ammonite type result. And I think part of that is exploiting, that the grammar is very good at generating spirally type stuff and ammonite type stuff. And Gemini was very quick to sort of just jump on the most obvious visual sort of thing and go, oh, that looks a bit spirally, let's go for spirals. And then the spirals got a bit sort of like, tightly wound spirals, and it goes, oh, that looks a bit snail-like. So it was quite, it was an attractor for it. It would go into these sorts of like rabbit holes quite often. So there's another spiral result. So we ran a few of these experiments. We end up with a lot of interesting structures. We tried prompting it to say, pick a real world object, not spirals, please. But it would pick something that was still spiral-like, but maybe not spirals. We got some nice, interesting results with the wabi-sabi. I don't know how you pronounce this Japanese sort of minimalist style. So like an ikebana sort of bonsai sort of style, and it came out with some like quite nice styles like that. But again, this was more of a sort of targeted evolution, but is aesthetically targeted rather than a specific object target. So I guess basically this takes us on to sort of foundational evolution, essentially, where we're saying, if we put foundation model into the heart of the evolutionary process as the evaluator, as the judge, and then use that to guide the process. So I've got some technical. How are we doing for time? So I'll give you like a sort of technical, sort of a high level sort of technical overview of how we sort of like incorporated Gemini into this process. So essentially, we implemented a genetic algorithm, which is basically an algorithm for optimizing a system. So at its heart, essentially, simplest, you have a population, like a set of possible solutions or answers or results that, and you have a selection process that basically selects on this population the ones that you think are better. So this could be used. You quite often is used for like optimizing things. If you want to minimize the route for a traveling salesman to visit a bunch of different cities, then you can have basically your candidates at a bunch of different routes. You measure all the distances, and then you pick out the ones that have got shorter distances, and those are the candidates that are doing better than the other ones. So you select your candidates based on some criteria, and then you just basically create new versions of those, but with some mutations. You change some of the routes up, or you change stuff up, and you put those back into your population, replacing the poorer ones in that population. And then you do the selection again. So essentially, you just repeat this process of selecting the better ones and then replacing the worst ones with new variants of the better ones. Repeat and repeat, and slowly the population of candidates gets better and better and better. So that's essentially sort of like a genetic algorithm in a nutshell. So essentially, we started with we had a very small population, so 16 forms in our population, which would be selected from, and Gemini would basically look at those. It'd have a criteria, say for example flyhead. It'd look at those 16. It'd pick the 8 that it thought looked, or pick the ones it thought was most flyhead-like. They would get mutated and replace the ones that were least flyhead-like. So this is essentially sort of where we slot Gemini into the loop. So where Gemini is there is normally where a human would be, looking at the images and making the selection. So we put Gemini into that little loop. Now, this is sort of like the first thing you think you do is, okay, I've got 16 images, give all 16 images to Gemini and get it to pick the best ones. First experiments showed that this is pretty much with all large language models like ChatGPT and Gemini. Essentially, they have a very large context window, it's called, the amount of data you can give them, and they have a bias towards the stuff that's early on in that window. They'll ignore a lot of the stuff that's at the end. It's actually, sometimes it's U-shaped, so they'll attend to this stuff at the beginning and at the end, and part of that is due to the architecture, and part of that is quite often just whenever you have like questions, the relevant bit to answer the question is right at the end of the sentence. So they have an inherent bias to look towards the end for a lot of their information, and then there's a lot of paths for information to flow from the beginning as well. So you get this U shape. We found quite a big drop off. So this is basically showing the number of votes that images got when they were in position 0 versus 1, 2, 3, 4 up to position 12. But shuffle the images around, and basically position 1 just got loads of votes, whatever image happened to be there. So not very good if you want an unbiased selector for your evolutionary process. So with some experimentation, we found quite a reliable, sort of like the least biased way of doing it. It was pretty much 50-50. We've done some sort of looking at some of the stats in one of the experiments recently, and it was for the flyhead one, it was sort of like it was about 55-65 or something like that, biased towards the first, but that could have just been in that experiment. We haven't looked at all the other ones yet. But essentially, the most reliable is at binary tournaments, where you only give it 2 images at once. And then you say, select which one of these images is better. And then there was very little bias towards the first or second image. So we present all the images to Gemini as pairs now. And you can see here, this sort of decisions that Gemini has been given. So this was an example from the chicken experiment. So the problem was, pick which one looks most like a chicken or has promise to evolve into a chicken. And so it was then asked to provide the positive and negative pros and cons for each, and then provide a selection of which one it's picked and the rationale for why it's picked that one. And we didn't guide it as to what the selection process should be. We didn't give it any, we didn't say it's got to be realistic or anything like that. We just said, give us the pros and cons. So it was up to the Gemini to then select what the criteria was that was important at any particular point in time. So you can see here, it sort of like lists a bunch of features. You know, there's a thing there that could become a wing. There's a round body shape there. That's quite positive. The other one is not chicken-like and far less. And then it gives, like, you know, reasoning for which one it's picked and why it's picked it. And generally, if you get them to sort of explain their decision, then it makes their decision more reliable, because their final decision is based on the text that they've just been generated, which has to have some sort of like sensible sort of reasoning sort of like embedded in it. So we went with binary tournaments. So essentially, yeah, we have that loop there, but then of all the images that come out of Mutator, only pairs of images go into Gemini to then be evaluated. So roughly, essentially here at the top there is an example. So essentially we have like the population, it would be 16 normally images. They're randomly paired up into the binary tournaments. Gemini then looks at the pairs and says which one is most like X, and it gives a tick or a cross for each one in the pair. And then the ones that are successful go on to have they survive plus a child of theirs, a mutant of theirs survives. And then that new population of 16 then goes back into the top, and then that process just runs for 200 generations. The way we at each, when you have your offspring, there's a mutation process level that determines how sort of different the offspring are from the parent. And so that mutation level, we start very high at the beginning of the experiment. So there's a lot of exploration, a lot of different forms are being generated. And then we slowly ramp that down over the 200 generations. And the important thing we realized, we weren't doing initially, it was that we needed to tell Gemini that this was happening. So originally it didn't know how long the experiment was running for, and it didn't know that there was a mutation rate that was being adjusted. So quite towards the end of the experiment, you'd see it still, you know, optimistically going, oh, I'm going to pick this because I think that's going to have the future potential of evolving into a chicken. It didn't realize at this point we're about to stop the experiment and the mutation rate's so low, you just should be fine tuning at this point. So in the prompt, we then explained that the experiment is running for 200 generations. You're at generation 50 or whatever. There's a mutation rate that's being ramped down. And then you can see in the logs at the beginning, it says, oh, I'm going to pick this over that one. This one's got a bit of a wing, which has potential to be a chicken, but actually there's not much of a body, so I won't go for that. I'm going to go for this thing, which looks less like a chicken, but looks like a blob that could be used later on to become the body of a chicken. And it knew it was exploring at that point, whereas later on it was like, right, I'm going to give up trying to, you know, evolve ahead on this thing, because right at the end I'm just going to try and pick ones that have got the finer details that I can control at this point. And so that was the mutation rate that we ramped down. And also, because we're running on fairly small populations, what you can do is you can quite quickly lose diversity. So you quickly end up with a population that are all very similar looking. And then it's hard to get out of that, especially if you've got the mutation rate going down. And so there's a bunch of things you can do. You can you can detect these and artificially bump up the mutation rate again. You could give Gemini some history of what's been happening and let Gemini control that. We didn't do that. That's something that we'd like to do, but it doesn't see that at the moment. And the simple thing that we did, which seems to have a positive impact, was essentially this pixel score that William talked about earlier, which was every so often, instead of getting Gemini to pick parents based on the criteria, we would get, for two of the individuals in the population, we'd select them based purely on their pixel score. So the ones that looked more complex in their presentation on the screen. And so that helps add a bit of sort of like what was it called, creative disruption I didn't give it that name. Gemini gave it that name when it was explaining what it's doing when it was explaining the logs. It said, "Oh, there's creative disruption going on here." So, but that helps sort of like get it outside some of these sort of like stagnant sort of processes. And then sort of, so to the system, then we have so that binary tournament there, all the information from all the comparisons, all the reasoning. It's all logged and it's all captured. And then after an experiment, we get Gemini to then look at each generation and look at what happened and give us a summary of what happened in that generation, write a narrative and generate some images of what it thinks were the interesting ones in that population, in that generation. And then after an experiment, we get Gemini again to look at all of the different summaries and give us a summary of the whole experiment and identify phases in the evolution and pick out highlights in the experiment of what happened when. And so then you get like a high level view, all being generated from Gemini again. And then that was all put into a website which we would use to explore all these experiments. But then in the gallery now, there's on one of the big screens, all these experiments are there, and you can dive right down into every single binary tournament and look at exactly what the decisions were made. There's 1,600 binary tournaments for each experiment, and each one of those are sort of like all explorable in the gallery. And so yeah, so sort of summarize all the experiments started with this very simple this column here, and then ended with this sort of family of mutations. Did you want to say something about this slide? Or
yeah, very very quickly.
Yeah.
So initially we had a more complicated form than the stack of spheres. We gave it something that looked a little bit more like a lobster, and we thought, right, we got a bit of branching here, we got some rib cages here. That's going to be great, and that'll get the system off to a good start. And we found it quite hard to get any traction or get onto any kind of paths around using prompts. Interestingly, we then stripped it right back to a stack of spheres, and the rib cage structure, which can grow at anywhere along that column, a rib cage could grow out, for example, if that random number comes up. And we found just a simple switch to a stack of spheres opened up the potential for the number of forms that we could create. I think what was interesting was that in the very first meeting, we discussed this model, the idea of mutator doing the procedural stuff, doing the rendering, and then chucking all the images over the fence to Gemini, and the scoring being done on the Gemini side and passing it back. And this was the kind of the vision right from the start, the idea of Gemini doing the scoring and the labor being removed from the human. I'll pass back to Dylan to finish off for the chickens.
Yeah, so this is an example of essentially from the summary of all of the generation summaries that Gemini did. This is like, there's a big long web page full of lots of different phases, but essentially one of the nice features it does, it picks out key points in the evolution where significant things happened, and we'll document those and sort of explain, this is where, we first got a blob that we thought we could work with, and then here suddenly it's like the first time I saw something like legs or something like that, or certain features. And so it's a very neat way of sort of like diving in, because there's so much information that gets generated from each experiment. I mean, you do have to go in and check, because I mean, obviously language models are still prone to hallucinating sometimes, so you sometimes need to go back and make sure that they didn't make some of this stuff up, but they are pretty good. It's been quite reliable on what it does. And I've sort of like read some of these things and I thought, did that really happen? I've gone back into the logs to check, and it's like, oh yeah, it did. So that was quite reassuring.
Okay, I'll pick up the slides for a bit. So here is one of our horseshoe crabs. You can see the lines where you get a kind of a dense, thick row of lines. That's where the system is repeatedly kicking out variants again and again and again. And each time, as you can see, there's sort of black, dense areas. the offspring have been no better than the parent. So it doesn't then follow that path. It just keeps going, and eventually it breaks out of the loop, and then it jumps forward. And as Dylan was highlighting, the use of the random mutation is really critical. As he was highlighting, if you're too far down the end, you're going to reduce the mutation rate, and that's both the structure mutation and the parametric mutation to be very, very small. And so one of the things we're working on now is the system recognizing where it's getting stuck and then bumping up the mutation rate automatically. And so rather than getting into a kind of cul-de-sac, just at the point where it should be refining, you kind of give it a mutation boost, and then you're out and free again. This idea of targeted evolution, is viewed as being very a tricky topic by biologists, but it's interesting. This is an example where the Gemini is defining the environment, which is driving the evolution. So this is an interesting example. This shows the 46 parents between top left, the stack of spheres, and getting to our nice little fly head. And so these are the evolutionary steps that we've taken from the larger tree. And the surprise is actually how early on in the mutation process it's picking up fly-like features. So just moving forward. So this was one of our most exciting moments as a development team. The chameleon had been eluding us. We just could not get any decent chameleon. It was like the early days with chickens. And then finally we get something that looks like a chameleon. I guess the jury might be out a little bit, the audience here, but you can see something that looks like a chameleon. It's kind of getting mixed up with the branch that it's sitting on. But from an artistic point of view, there's something very interesting about these kind of cubist forms that are sort of halfway between reality and being purely abstract structures. And the whole approach we're using is quite analytical. So we give every generation a number, everything is referenced. And as Dylan's highlighted, all these forms sit within a giant evolutionary tree. We've got a tree behind this, which is just purely generating chameleons. So we're talking a little bit about the exhibition. So they're large-scale prints. My background in printmaking means that I have a big interest in digital printing. My two visiting PhD students, Lin and Tina, produced some wonderful three-dimensional diagrams of the work. And one of the questions that people ask me, is the whole series of 12 evolutionary trees the artwork, or is all the software? Is the software the artwork, or is the physical artwork the artwork? Family. So we also, in addition to presenting the big evolutionary trees, we're presenting the families. Future work and ideas. So I'll touch on this one briefly and then pass back to. So humor. So what was interesting, when I typed in the word flyhead into Gemini, I thought I was going to get a serious fly, a bit like an Escher type thing. And what do I get? I get a humorous fly, a laughing fly. And so what's interesting is that Gemini is starting to shift my aesthetic. And we had the same thing with dinosaurs. We typed in spiky dinosaurs, and I thought I was going to get a dinosaur from some of my books I enjoyed looking at as a child of dinosaurs. And what do I get? A kind of humorous dinosaur, looking like it's out of a cartoon film. So this is what's interesting. The machine is giving you back stuff you don't expect. Now, the question for me as the artist is, do I go with the flow? Do I go into Disney territory, have a bit of fun for a while? People have always viewed my work as being a bit serious. Or do I work on all the prompts to kind of tighten it up? So this was another example where we gave the system the prompt a smiling face, and we get these strange smiling faces by about 200, generation 200, more kind of comic elements that are emerging. So I'll pass back to Dylan in a second. So in some ways, do you view this whole project as the equivalent to Burgess' shale, where evolution took a sort of took a different branch and produced all these kind of fantastical creatures? Is this our own computerized version of Burgess' shale, creating these forms? What we're not doing is anything like Carl Sims' work with locomotion from the 90s. We're not scoring these forms on their ability to move or other criteria. We're just purely going on visual likeness and structure. But what is clear is that Gemini is far more knowledgeable than I am as the artist. So, am I handing over complete control to the machine to create art by itself? I'll pass back to Dylan.
Yeah, so some other sort of future sort of like areas that we've sort of been discussing that would be interesting to look at would be, I mean, for example, I mean, at the moment, Gemini only sees a 2D picture. I mean, could we use this process could get Gemini to produce full three-dimensional structures? And a simple way of doing that would be to essentially give it 3 images, like orthographic projection of the image, the top, side, and front, and say this has to look like a fly head. Or you could even give it a video of the model and get it to try and select on that process. So we didn't do that initially because that increases the computational load quite significantly. And it's an area we thought could be interesting to look at. I think another one would be essentially here, Gemini has got a fairly limited view of what's going on. So it sort of looks at a population and it knows what the criteria is and it makes selection. We don't give it a history of how things have been evolving. If it did, then it could make better, more informed decisions over maybe whether to change mutation levels, whether to add structure mutation or to change parameter mutation and that sort of stuff. So I think giving it more understanding of the whole process would enable us to give it more control over the whole process as well, which should hopefully make it improve its capabilities. I think going back to looking, investigating the its ability to do intelligent mutations again would be quite good. And again, giving it examples of mutations and what their effects are visually, and then training it on that and giving it that sort of stuff would be good. And I think another thing is sort of like tightening the loop with a human inside that loop as well. So at the moment, it's sort of like human sets up a lot of this system and then we press go and you get your 200 generations. It would be interesting if you sort of pause every so often, you can step in and go, oh, actually, this is really interesting. Can you follow this route for a minute, please? Or even change the prompt a little bit, or select on certain parts and say, oh, I really like this part of this rose. Can you just keep this and then mutate around that with this other thing in mind and sort of make it more of a interactive process as well? I think that would be an interesting sort of avenue to take it as well. I think there's loads more other stuff, but I can't remember it at the moment.
I think we're nearly the end of the talk.
Cool. Perfect.
But so yeah, there's we've got lots of interesting to-dos on our list at the moment. Certainly the big surprises with the ink block test. The machine is able to see the potential of an ammonite or a horseshoe crab, whereas a human can't. So it can be like a tangled mass of stuff, but the machine can see the potential. What the machine isn't so good at is changing direction. So when the manual mutator you're picking and breeding, if something looks a bit like a python, and then something that looks more like a crocodile, looks like a better crocodile, the human is quite good at changing track. And that's one of the things the machine, so that open-ended creativity, the machine currently is not quite as good. But I think that we've probably covered enough. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Yep. Question.
When a fly landed on the screen, and it made me wonder because you've obviously taken lots of inspiration from the natural world and living beings in the natural world. And I wondered what it feels like to come out of like your office now and encounter those living beings in the natural world, and how it might have changed the way that you see them. And then also, I was also struck, William, when you had, I think, yourself or the AI to Pandora. And I wondered if you could both say a bit more about to what extent you feel.
Gosh, I guess, you know, so my interest in the system is to get forms out that sort of really make with an audience. So, you know, we show a lot in galleries. You can see when an image has real impact, kind of visceral quality, organic quality. And so, you know, the reason why I'm interested in this system is to see what forms you can get to. But yeah, so the natural world I'm just looking at as a sort of starting point. This is a kind of synthetic version of the natural world. So what was your question again?
So like artists have always looked at the world around them, produced things, made things, and then those things that they make help us see the world a bit differently. So I was wondering, how does this art make you see the world a bit differently?
So, okay, that's a good question. I think the way of contextualizing this art is like going back to the Renaissance, where the mathematicians and architects and painters were all communicating and working together. You know, perspective was invented by Brunelleschi and then it's picked up by painters. So for me, from my point of view, like working closely with DeepMind and then back in the 80s at IBM, I see it's that type of dynamic. I'm looking for the best talent in that space to work with. And then the art world, I really don't care about too much, because I know if you get the team right, then good, cool stuff will emerge. But I think, you know, the contemporary art is on a very particular track at the moment. But if you go back to Renaissance time, it's kind of refreshing, you know, how the maths and art were all kind of mixed up.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, I'm always like, you know, when you look at, I mean, it's particularly plants and flowers and things like that, when you look at them in detail and you look at the structure, and I think about the development process that they go through to produce like the fractal structures and things like that. And I'm always like constantly reminded about the sort of simple processes that are produce, you know, very complex, sort of interesting patterns and structures and dynamics. And so I think like this just reminds me, like, you know, this is like tip of the iceberg of what's going on in the natural world, in the sort of complexity of what's going on to grow a flower or something like that. But seeing this sort of crossover between those two worlds, and, you know, using inspiration for one and the other is I like that sort of like the intersection between those two spaces. Thanks. Yep. Oh.
I'm kind of interested in how you're observing the stages and the mutations that have been generated due to whatever heritage, prosperity, research, or whatever. What's your approach to holding it on time?
At the moment, it's just stored on a big drive somewhere. But yes, we want to hold on to it. And also, I think it's valuable. I mean, we've got a lot of, I mean, in each one of those experiments, there's like thousands of mutations and offspring that you don't get to sort of see. But there's like even just using that as as material for then training AI to like learn more about the processes, so it could get better at doing mutations or understand the process itself, is another example for holding on to it. But yeah, we have like all the genes from all the experiments and all the decisions, everything like logged. We don't have we haven't put together an archive sort of like approach yet, but that would be pretty cool to do. Yeah.
change society. Gosh.
I don't know. I mean, I think there's like a growing area of like looking to where we can use AI to help, you know, to improve and enhance and amplify our own sort of like capabilities. So as a sort of creative tool, so co-creating art with AI. I think is like a useful thing, not just using AI and typing in a prompt and pops out your picture and you go, that's it. That's not creativity, but it's actually much more. It's an iterative process, and using that as a either tool to mine your own sort of like creative ability, or using it as a tool to you know, in Mutator to explore like a world of sort of mathematics and physics that are sort of embedded in this rule system, and then discover, you know, go on a journey together to like discover new things. So I think like as a sort of creative, co-creative sort of tool, I think it's got a lot of potential in that sort of space.
That's a very interesting question. You know, I think with AI, we've seen tons of stuff with Midjourney, lots of stuff with photographs and video. But this is tying it back more to structural biology. And you're answering Brona's question. This ties nicely into Dawkins' biomorph system, Carl Sims' later work. So historically, you can position it, and you can say this is a kind of demonstrator for the potential of evolution, and whether way downstream, someone could look at embryology, where things are splitting. There is a kind of grammar, and maybe use this as an influence of their understanding of embryology. But at the moment, this is just quite playful. You know, it is what it is. How people then interpret that and do something with it is a, you know, another question. A good hard question. Go ahead.
You touched upon it just then, and in some of your the things you've said before. But do you think that because now the Gemini is mainly used to assess the aesthetic and the appearance of the models created, but would it be able to assess and understand the utility and the function of each structure it's created, and eventually use that in like the embryotic development, or even reliving through the whole evolution process? Do you think that's possible to achieve? Or
I think that's possible. I don't think out of the box. I mean, so the Gemini we used here was not like any special internal development version of Gemini. The whole right at the beginning of the project, the idea was to do everything using external facing software that anybody could use. And I mean, these experiments, I mean, each one of those evolutionary runs cost about £30 to run, calling the Gemini API. So they're not super expensive to run. And it's just using Gemini out of the box. And I think like if you actually, I think you could train a data set where you could actually teach it very specific things about certain aspects of the image relate to this type of part of the grammar, and you could potentially like give it much more control over, and then it could do the mutations and have a better understanding as to where things were going. I think that's feasible. I think it's quite a big project, but yeah, I don't think that's unreasonable.
History, or did you prompt anything in it before that, or
So the prompt, essentially the prompt is like, it's a small paragraph when it's doing the binary tournaments. When it's doing the comparison between two images, essentially the prompt is sort of roughly, basically it says you're doing a artistic assessment of these two images. This is part of an evolutionary art experiment. These are two randomly selected from a population of 16. I want you to select the one that looks most like a X or has the potential to evolve into an X. The experiment runs for 200 generations. You're at generation N, and the mutation rate ramps down to 0 over that period. And then it's basically now give me the pros and cons for each image, and select one of the images with your rationale. And that's essentially the prompt, you know, in more or less words, and no other context or history or anything like that.
Do you then, Chrysanthemum?
during the exhibition is about because you're assessing like the 3D object, right? So thinking about, is there any way that you can actually sort of, instead of choosing two pictures, like we're choosing two set of pictures with them front and back and like set of colors, a set of angles of the pictures, and make it like make the LM more understand about like this is a set for a 3D object and this is the other.
Yeah, I think the simplest thing would just give it top, side, and front view, and say here's the the top, side, and front of this image. Here's the top side of that, and we're looking for flyhead. And I think it's probably seen lots of examples of orthographic projection images and stuff, so it'd know that that's supposed to be the side, that's supposed to be top, and it would be. I think it would do a reasonably good job out of the box. Yeah, we haven't tried it, and I think yeah, it'd be interesting to see, and especially when there's like conflict. If it looks really good like a fly from the side in this one, but looks really good like a fly from the front in this one, how does it decide which one to go for? But I think maybe that maybe where it will be very good, because it'd be very good at like not being sucked in by something that's too obvious, and actually, I think this one's got more potential. And I'll go with that, even though it looks less like a fly, maybe, or something like that.
Thank you
very much. I think it's been a brilliant collaboration and produced some very interesting structures. I suppose I wanted to ask you, William, how do you think, like all your computer work, if you compare it to your original mutation work, I'd like you to sort of tell me firstly which you prefer, and secondly, how you think it differs, because my feeling was that in the original broad work, there was intentionality, a lot of sort of human reasoning and intentionality in the mutation. I could sort of see why you'd done something, and that was itself curious. And so, a lot of the mutations produced here, I can't sort of see the intentionality in it. But anyway, I just wanted you to talk about.
So that's a good question. So the original form synth drawings, I had a set of rules, and I was using my brain as the drawing device, imagining the result of taking a cone, taking a big scoop out of it. What would that look like? Oh, I know what that. I can draw it. I'm quite good at drawing. So, and then it'd get a bulge, pull another giant bulging thing out of it, and I could draw. So it was a lot of fun producing those drawings. Ultimately, it got a little bit boring because they were huge. There was one that was 30 feet long that I showed in Tokyo in a big show there. One of the challenges was, as a human, I'd be always trying to elaborate the rules, even though I said, right, for this drawing, I'm going to stick to these rules. But actually, I'd be saying, well, let's add fractalize as one of the rules. A lot of people still really like that old work. They say, really, do keep showing that work. I guess, as an artist, I'm looking for shock value. So what's great now is the machine is chucking stuff back at me that I can't anticipate. And you get a little bit of a rush when you're on a good track. Say, oh, this is really looking like a strange horseshoe crab from some alien galaxy or something. So there's a kind of feedback loop where you get a little bit of a kick from. Particularly when it gets dull, you feel quite negative. And like artists traditionally, like people like Matter would throw a bucket of paint at the canvas to get going, and then so the system is giving stuff. It's a dialogue between me and the machine, and I don't know what the machine's going to come up with, but I know by fine-tuning form grind, it's got the potential to come up with forms which I've had some involvement with.
You don't feel anything's been lost?
I don't know. I guess it's been, I like the journey, the collaboration's been pretty working with Dylan and Stephen. A good question. Interestingly, I've started doing some drawings again whilst the machine is churning out all the variants, and I'm creating a new series of drawings called Drawings Done Under the Influence of Mutator and Gemini. So I'm taking some of the philosophy and drawing some very dense drawings. So maybe that by getting the machine's AI to generate the art, it's actually freeing up time for me to start doing some conventional drawings again. But that's a very hard question. Yeah, drawing is still relevant. But yeah, and people do still like the original form synth drawings. That's why we show some of them in the show. So I think you're next.
Thank you, Peter. Probably following on from this last question and the question earlier about the impact on society. It occurred to me while you were presenting this imagery that you were retracing or anyway moving between the beginning and the present. And while it is very interesting to see that evolution doesn't end with us. So then I started playing with the idea, what if the foundation is now and you play it forward? But that would be a different way of doing science fiction here, with a lot of science, and a lot of different kind of fiction. I think.
So I'll try and answer. In some ways, this is like a kind of classic software development project. We've got a list, so like crossbreeding within the population, not just breeding from a single. And the idea is if you're breeding all these forms, you find a really cool one, you put it aside in a kind of breeding pool, if you like. And so that's the stuff we're thinking about right now. What improvements can we make to the system? I guess this is a kind of classic piece of software engineering. It is ultimately can be viewed as art, but it can be viewed as a demonstrator of how you take AI into the procedural geometry space. It's an example, if you like. We've decided, interestingly, rather than writing a paper and locking the work away for another 6 months, we just decided to do an exhibition, get out there and share it. And do you want to answer that question? It's a kind of hard one.
No, I'll pass on that.
Okay. We'll come back to you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I suppose I see it as a tool to collaborate with. So I guess I think a lot of people use it just as like the next version of Google. They just type in their question and what comes out is like they go, okay, that's fine. And I think that's totally the wrong way to do it. And I don't think you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. And if you don't really think about what you're putting in, you're not going to get anything out of it. So it's like most good tools, you need to know how to use them. You need to know how to use them well. And quite often it's an iterative process. If you want to get a really good result out of any of these sorts of AI systems, is that you'll prompt it. And you might, first thing you can do is ask it, how should I ask the question? Because they're quite good at telling you, oh, you're interested in this. Well, actually, you need to think about these. And then you can like put that back in and say, okay, now give me that. So you can sort of bootstrap the whole process by asking Gemini for that sort of information at the beginning. But yeah, I think this sort of stuff should be taught, at schools of how to use this sort of system, because people just don't know how to use them. They just think they're just one-shot things. You answer a question and it will give you the answer you need back. And I think that's not a good role. So I think trying to like demonstrate how to use these as productive tools and is a good sort of like one example of like being able to use it.
I guess I feel a little bit competitive, like the humor creeping in. So I don't want humor, but we say, well, can we refine the prompt so it's a kind of Gothic fly head? I have an idea of what that would look like, but we did some work on Gothic as a prompt. So yeah, but I'm very interested in sort of how can you refine the prompt a lot to get something close to what I want. But it's kind of been exciting as well, seeing what the machine will come up with.
Yeah, and I think like again, like a potential for next use, iteration of this would be one where the human's involved at lots of different stages in that process. So you can step in at one point and go, "You're going a bit too humorous, thank you. Like, can we pull it over this way?" Yeah, exactly. You can sort of steer it and work together. And it'll be like, "No, but maybe you want dark and humorous, do you?" And you go, "No." And so you can end up with something at the end where it's sort of like maybe has found something that it thinks is really good, and between you two, you end up with something interesting.
Yeah, definitely conversation, ongoing conversation live.
Yeah.
Go on, Terence.
I had a question. Do you have any examples of prompts you're trying to give it that it just couldn't do, or types of things that it was really struggling with?
Well, I mean, the chameleon and the chickens it struggled with. Those, I mean, everything it got. I mean, the in the exhibition there's 12 different ones. We ran more than that, and to get like some results that were good, and quite well, sometimes you'd end up with stuff that just didn't quite look, hit the target as you want. I think like I'd be quite interested in like go back and doing a bit more on the open-ended one where it picks its own target, but trying to find out a way of prompting it so that it's more focused on picking its own goal and making sure that goal isn't just the obvious go for a spirally thing. But I don't know how to do that quite yet because that's a bit tricky, but that'd be quite interesting.
They sell painting or something, and then some people pay a lot of money. It make good images. It will be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, these are all.
It's a good question. There's copyright in the code, which there's Gemini on one side and then our code on the other side. So that's reasonably straightforward. The art, I don't know. We haven't even thought about that.
I think it did come up because I had to go through all of the red tape and all of the stuff at DeepMind. And essentially, as we said, we'd keep the code separate, so there's no complication there. And DeepMind said we aren't interested in, the art is for the artist to do with what they want. I think you just need to like check. But yeah, it's like it's like DeepMind didn't want ownership over the art or any complications in that sort of space. I think.
So you've had hard questions
Allegedly.
tonight. Any final questions? Probably, Frederick, we're out of time nearly.
Thanks to the speakers again.
Go and mention the brochure.
Yes, so when you leave, please, if you want, there's brochures from the exhibition and details from what was explained today. So you're welcome to take one.